Hello, my name's Mr. Landrum. I am a eighth grade social studies teacher at West Valley Middle School. I'm not real fancy with this, how to make a video, so I really just know how to use a PowerPoint and talk over it. So, but there's a picture of me so you can see me. And I have week 5 of the summer at home for Knox County Schools in eighth grade social studies. And today we're going to talk about the physical and economic aspects of Reconstruction. After the lesson, you should be able to explain the importance of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, also known as the Civil War Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and then explain some of the issues faced by freed African Americans, which will include some of these, not all of them, but the Freedmen's Bureau in particular, and then other problems that were facing newly freed slaves. In Lesson 6, you'll learn more about the social and political implications of the Civil War. Today, we're talking about the physical and economic aspects of the Civil War, all consequences of the Civil War, all things that came out of the Civil War during this period following the Civil War, which is known as Reconstruction. In Lesson 7, you'll learn about the various plans for Reconstruction because not everybody agreed how do you rebuild the country after the Civil War. I'll briefly, though, preview the economic plans that deal with the newly freed African Americans. The more specific plans will be dealt with in Lesson 7. Before we can get into any discussion of Reconstruction, though, we need to know what the word means. So following the Civil War, the South was absolutely destroyed. Think about Sherman's March to the Sea, where the Union Army basically brought a total war campaign where they not only fought Confederate soldiers, but as they won victories, they destroyed everything around them, farms, towns, everything, set fire to everything. And this was all done in the interest of trying to break the will of the South. You also have issues of slaves. You have millions of slaves, about 4 million of them that are now free. What's going to become of them? They're going to need jobs. They're going to need a place to live. You got to figure that out. Cities, farms, and infrastructure is wiped out. And by infrastructure, you mean things like railroads, canals, methods of communication. That stuff is all wiped out. So everything really is going to have to be rebuilt. In later lessons, you'll also talk about how do you bring states back into the United States. Do you punish them or do you just let the southern states back in? And then what do you do with those people who supported the Confederacy? Should Confederate soldiers, for instance, ever be allowed to vote in the United States again? And this is seen by some as an open act of treason, and it should have been punished. And others said there's been enough fighting and that, and you need to just let them back in. So today, again, we're going to deal with the physical and economic implications of the Civil War in the United States. But let's break down that word Reconstruction. So you see the root word there is construction. And we all know, the word construction means to build. And then you add re to it, means to rebuild. So to build again, implying that the South, what was a built society, and the Civil War just wiped it out. And now you've got to rebuild it into something new. And that is what this period of Reconstruction is going to be about. The most important political things that came during the period of Reconstruction are known as the Civil War Amendments, and that's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment is the amendment that freed the slaves. Now, after the slaves were freed, people assumed, okay, well, everybody's equal and citizenship's all the same and all that, but then laws were passed that limited citizenship, so then they passed the 14th Amendment, which said anybody born in the United States, which would include if you were a slave but you were born here, you have the full rights of citizenship. And because of the way the laws were, the transcontinental slave trade was banned, so if basically you were a slave here, you had to be given the rights of citizenship, because if you were brought over from Africa, most likely it was done illegally, and now that person might be in more trouble. So anyway, this was supposed to protect the rights, and in particular, the right to vote and hold office. Then again, laws get passed that stop them from doing that, so they passed the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed African American men, women still aren't allowed to vote. They're not going to be allowed to vote till the 19th Amendment in 1920, 1919, 1920. Someone's right to vote could not be taken away based on race or because they were once a slave. So all men were allowed to vote, regardless of color or if you were at one time a slave. But again, you'll learn later that there are laws that will be passed to stop that. In the next lesson, you'll spend more time with these amendments, but before we move forward with a discussion of the economic and physical implications of the Civil War, it's good to know what these three important amendments were that happened during this period of Reconstruction. So real quick, just to review, the word Reconstruction means to rebuild, and we're going to rebuild the South after the Civil War. And then the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, also known as the Civil War Amendments, will be passed during this period. The 13th Amendment will free the slaves. 14th will guarantee their rights of citizenship, although guarantee is not really going to be what happens. And then the 15th Amendment will give all men the right to vote, regardless of their skin color or if they were once a slave. But again, that'll also be attacked, and really it won't be until the 1950s and 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement that we see the 14th and 15th Amendment fully carried out. And there are some people that would say we still have work to do in some of these areas, even today. But that's not really what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about the physical destruction of the South and the economic implications of the Civil War. So before we get into those economic implications, let's take a few minutes to consider the physical destruction of the South. So I'm going to show you 5 slides, and on your worksheet, the accompanying worksheet to this video, you'll see these same pictures. They're going to be a little bigger on here, so you might want to look at the pictures on here and just pause after each slide. But I want you to look at each picture, and I want you to consider how it shows the impact of the war on Southern society, and then you can write down your answers on the accompanying worksheet. Now for just a minute, I'm just going to kind of quietly go through these. I'm just going to stay on each picture for about 10 seconds. But I would, on your end, I would pause it on each picture, write down your sentence or two about what you see there that shows the impact of the war on Southern society. And really it's all about the physical destruction of the South. Show what was destroyed and how that is a problem, and then record your answers on the worksheet. And then after we go through that, then I'll stop and talk about each picture just briefly. All right, go ahead and get your pencil out and get your worksheet out, and you should see the pictures on the worksheet. I think it's on page 2, I believe. All right, so now we're going to briefly review these pictures, and hopefully you've jotted a couple things down about each one. This isn't a real tough assignment. It's just something to make you think about the pictures that we're looking at. And this is about the physical effects of the Civil War on the United States, in particular the South, where almost the entire Civil War was fought outside the Battle of Gettysburg. So the first picture is Charleston, South Carolina. And you see a church there and a theater in the foreground. Foreground means up front, so right here in the front you'll see a theater was knocked down. You see destruction of a church. So again, this just shows that even in the towns, that the countryside was not the only place where the fighting happened, and that towns themselves were destroyed and many times just had to be completely rebuilt. Here's the ruins of a train station, passenger station in Atlanta. Again, if you're in Atlanta, you're not out in the country, so this is fighting that's occurring in the middle of the city where people live. There's a train wiped out, so we discussed infrastructure. Trains are an important piece of infrastructure. Main way to, back then, people to get around, to get materials around, resources around. So there was a lot of destroyed train tracks and bridges and all kinds of things like that. So the infrastructure will need to be rebuilt. Again, a bridge would also be an example of infrastructure because it helps you get across waterways, and there you see a bridge completely wiped out. And finally, Sherman's March to the Sea, and you can see the flames kind of in both pictures, and they just show the absolute destruction of everything that happened whenever Sherman's men marched towards the end of the war. This is what they did. They burnt down the buildings, they burnt down the fields, they made it total war. They were trying to break the will and the capacity of the South to even fight war. All right, so we've thought about the physical implications of the Civil War a little bit. Now let's turn our attention to the economics of Reconstruction. And first we need to know what we mean by the word economics. Now on your worksheet it says to define the word. So why don't you go ahead and pause it for a second and then go ahead and look it up and write down the definition that you find of economics. All right, hopefully you paused it and looked it up. The definition for economics, and if yours is way different than this one, then maybe you could write this one down. Economics is the study of the way that people make decisions about production and consumption given limited resources. And really that should be make, not made. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that because I can. So economics is the study of the way people make decisions about production and consumption given limited resources. And in simple terms, it's just people have resources, whether that's you have a business or you can do a job. And the main resources you really have is money, or the resources you have you can sell, or the work you can do will make you money, and you can use that to purchase other things that you want. So that's the main way we do it, and that's the main way it was done in the Civil War. But now that the South is completely destroyed, people have to make these decisions about how the South is going to produce and what's needed to consume in their society, given that it was heavily damaged and they're no longer slaves. Just because slaves were not slaves does not mean they had jobs to go to or training to get jobs. So the whole economy had to be rebuilt. It was based on slave labor. Slaves are no longer there. So now what's it going to be based on? And that's the question that is going to have to be asked in the South. So let's talk about and I'm going to let the lesson 7, they're going to talk about the plans for Reconstruction in the South. That'll get a little more into that. But I'm going to talk about the economic plan briefly for African Americans. So for some, they just went back to work for their old masters. But now they went as wage laborers. And on your worksheet, it says to think about why they may have done that. You know, you had a slave owner that you probably didn't like very much, and yet you're just going to go back to work for them. So why would you think about that? So go ahead and pause your video for just a second and look at your worksheet and jot down an idea as to why you think they might go back to work for their old masters as wage laborers now instead of slaves. All right, we're back, and I hope you paused it and jotted something down. But here's really the reason. The one thing that these slaves really knew how to do at this point was farm. And these farms still needed to be worked. There was still a demand for cotton, and cotton still needed to be picked, and they would work very inexpensively. Slaves were used to not having very much, so it didn't take a lot of money for them to kind of at least have what they were accustomed to. And they didn't really have any other skills, and sometimes maybe didn't feel like they had other options. So they went back to work for their old masters, even though that might not sound ideal for a lot of them. That was what they thought was their best option. Some also became sharecroppers. They didn't want to work directly for their old masters. They wanted a little bit of their own, but they also knew they needed land. If you know how to farm, it's great to say, well, I'll be a farmer, but you still have to have land. And sharecropping is where a landowner gives somebody a portion of land, and then there's an agreement to share in the crops that are grown in that land. And it's almost always a better deal for the landowner than the farmer because the landowner has the land. The sharecropper needs the land, and so when you negotiate it, it's always a better term for the owner of the land than it's going to be for the sharecropper. This very much is like feudalism, if you can remember seventh grade and you talked about feudalism. It works similar. The sharecropper grows land or grows food on the land, and then some of that food is given to the owner of the land and they sell it. So now, again, take a minute or two and think about why the sharecropper might go along with this, even though they know they're probably getting the short end of the deal on this. I'll go ahead and pause it for a second and write down on your paper what you think the reason would be that they would take that deal, even though it's not a good deal. So much like our wage laborers who just went back to work for the old masters, the sharecroppers didn't have a lot of options. But the one thing sharecropping did give you was ownership of your share of the crops. And with that, you might be able to make a little bit of profit, and with that profit, eventually buy your own land. So it for some was a better option. And then finally, there were efforts made to train freed African Americans to do other things. The first schools opened up for African Americans, and then the Freedmen's Bureau was established to teach them how to do jobs. And the Freedmen's Bureau also offered legal help and all kinds of other services, but their main service was education. They also helped feed African Americans who had a hard time initially getting food and basic supplies and basic goods that they needed. But their main thing was they trained them to do new jobs for the new Southern economy. So this isn't going to be a great situation for a lot of African Americans during Reconstruction, and it's going to take a long time for them to kind of get on their feet. I wish I could say Reconstruction following the Civil War was this period where America came together and everybody did well, but it's just not that time. It's a time where it was very hard on a lot of people, and there's a lot of nastiness among people that happens. But eventually America gets to the Civil Rights Movement, and it's going to take another 80 years following Reconstruction before the rights promised in Reconstruction really come about. But at least you see the starts of the seeds here. So despite the efforts by some, the majority of the newly freed African Americans will struggle, and it's going to take decades to close some of the gaps between families of former slaves and others. Some might say the struggle still continues today. Well, I want to thank you for taking a few minutes to listen to you. I hope you're enjoying your really long break. Just try to relax and make the most of it. And anyway, I'm glad that even though this is voluntary, you took the few minutes to watch the video and do the worksheets, and I do appreciate it. And I hope everybody has a good summer, and I guess you guys will be off to high school, so I hope you guys enjoy that. All right, thank you.